Okay, so I know I'm very late to this, however, it was sort of a last minute thought of mine to try and get something I could use to test the new microphone. And on top of that, if anyone's unfamiliar with some of the new changes in vehicles, I guess it works in that end as well. Okay, so starting off, America's got two new ground vehicles. Both of them are premium, unfortunately, but starting off, they got the M728 CEV. This thing should perform very similarly to the Centurion Avery that the British get. It's a licensed gun of the Centurion Avery. It's the same shell. It is lacking the ERA that the Centurion gets, however, it somewhat makes up for that by just being a more defensible hull, in my opinion. Of course, you also get the 50 cal, which is never something to complain about. Next, they've got the M1128 Wolfpack, the Striker AGS gun platform. It's very much the same vehicle that's in the tech tree, except for one minor trade-off. It drops zero point 0.3 of a BR and loses the M900 shell for the M833. Now, this shell does perform fairly significantly worse than the M900 shell. However, it is still a very solid shell, and there's not too many situations where you're going to end up needing the M900 shell over M833. I think this is going to be basically one of those vehicles where if you end up in an up tier, you're going to wish you were in the tech tree one. If you end up at top tier, you're going to wish that you were in the wolf pack, because obviously then you're facing 8.7s, which is, this thing is going to have a very easy time dismantling. You've got the rapid firing 105. This thing is very agile despite a lot of changes that have not benefited its maneuverability in the past couple months, years even. However, it's still a very strong platform, and honestly, the Tech Tree one is one of my favorite ground vehicles in the game. So this is something that I would probably say to look out for if you need something to grind those top trees. But in terms of aviation, with the addition of rank 8, we do now have rank 7 premiums. The Americans for this have the A6E Intruder with the tram targeting pod. This thing is an interesting vehicle in terms of how it's going to play out in air, I think. So it doesn't have a forward-facing gun, however, it is capable of mounting gun pods the same way the Skyhawk and the F4J do. I think it's the same 20 mil on those. It is a decent 20 mil, however, it's worth considering that it will be fitted onto one of these pylons, and as such, you aren't going to have a center gun, and it might be a little awkward to aim. That being said, there isn't really any reason to carry the gun pod over what you can put on it instead, which is going to be 4 AIM-9Ls under these wing pylons. The AIM-9L is a very strong performing IR missile right now, possibly the best in the game. If you get a rear lock with an AIM-9L, it's pretty much a guaranteed kill. Front looks are a little bit less secure, however at 10.0 you are going to have a fair number of vehicles to fight that don't have any flares. In that situation, they're going to struggle a lot more against the 9L front aspect, and it's probably worth going for it a little bit more. Of course, the main appeal is going to be the ground strike capability. We've got paveways, unguided bombs, you've got paveways, the GBU-12, the GBU-16, Zunis, which are very accurate at the moment, and you can also carry additional flares up to 960. You don't need to carry these though, as it does actually come with 60 flares on the aircraft itself. However, if you are incredibly scared of an R60 striking you, I guess the option's there to carry over 1,000 countermeasures. Then we have the F-16A. This is going to be the one that's actually unlocked second in the US tech tree, but this is the one that we saw in the test server. It's slightly more ground strike oriented, so it does trade off being able to carry radar missiles, which means you're not really going to be taking advantage of the very solid radar this thing has too often. However, it can still carry 6 AIM-9Ls, which, as I've just mentioned, are very strong missiles at this point in time. However, you're probably not going to want to carry too many, so you want to make space for the AGM-65s and the GBU-8s that are this thing's party piece. This is probably America's strongest multi-role right now in terms of its ability to engage aircraft and engage ground vehicles, so it might see a lot of use in ground forces. America do also have the F-16A ADF, so this is going to be very similar to the ADF that the Italians get and the MLU that the Chinese get. It is able to carry AIM-7Ms, which are very similar right now to AIM-7Fs in terms of performance. They do have a surprising amount of range, coupled with the fantastic radar this thing has. They can be very difficult to notch. I found them to be very, very solid, especially when used front aspect against enemies, since the AIM-9L at 11.7 sort of loses a lot of its potency. A lot of people are going to expect you to try and launch a 9L in a head-on, and they're very, very easy to flare front aspect. So if you keep the 9Ls for rear aspect, use the 7M for a front shot, and you should have a very, very, very good arsenal at your disposal. Biggest issue I have with the F-16 right now in terms of its ordnance is going to be the gun. The Vulcan just does not do the damage it once did. It's very, very inconsistent. Usually you will be able to get a kill if you get a couple rounds on a guy, however, it's very awkward to aim, its damage is not too good, and compared to the new 30 mil that the MiG-29 has, I would absolutely take that over this. Also, 500 rounds, compared to the Russians, that's plenty. Compared to other US fighters, it isn't too good. It's also worth pointing out that this control surface at the rear, this controls the roll. It's also used for the vertical pitch, obviously. It's slightly larger on the ADF and the MLU, so you should see slightly better maneuverability compared to the F-16s that don't have that, such as the Israeli one and the one I just showed. Germany has a new SPAA, the Gepard 1A2. This thing is pretty much just a Gepard, but it now has Fliegerfaust 2 Stingers on the sides. It has 4 of these in total, and it can fit the K variant of the Stinger, so very much similar to the LAVAD, but at a slightly lower BR. Add to that the fact you still have the search radar of the Gepard, this thing probably will be a little bit stronger than the LAVAD, and generally speaking should just be a very solid upgrade to the German SPA line, given that you can now use the Stingers as a fire and forget function, and you've got the tracking radar to use with the 35 mils, which are very, very potent, even against ground vehicles, since it will still be able to carry the APDS. In terms of air, the Germans now have the MiG-21 Lazur M. This thing's going to perform pretty much the same as the MiG-21 Bissau that the Germans already get. Same BR now. Also has 6 R60 MKs, same as the Bissau. Radar is the Sapphire 21, which isn't particularly good. Not that you'd want to use it, since the only missile that this thing gets that is going to really work with the radar is the R3R, and it is just not a very solid missile, especially at 11.3. They have also, with a lot of the MiG-21s, every MiG-21 that is of the BIS variant, so the Bissau, the MiG-21 BIS itself, the one that the Finnish get, they are all now 11.0, and they all now have all aspect R60, so they'll either have R60Ms or R60MKs. So in a manner of speaking, this is a buff to the Bissau, and is a buff to a lot of the other MiG-21s, since this has dropped its BR and the others have gained all aspect capabilities. The Germans, it's going to be the first Tornado we'll see today, have the interdictor version of the Tornado. This thing gets a fairly competent ground ordnance, being able to carry paveways 3 and 2, as well as unguided payloads. It is going to be able to carry a total of 2 9Ls, which isn't fantastic, but in ground forces should be enough to keep yourself safe if something comes up to engage you. The 27mm cannon that the Tornado gets also seems particularly good at the moment, and you can carry armor-piercing shells which go through 64mm, which in a pinch should be enough to take out a ground vehicle if you decide to strafe with it. This is probably the best performing Tornado in the game right now. If you were to go by stat card, it records going at 200 miles per hour faster than the Tornadoes that Italy and Britain get, and appears to be slightly more maneuverable. I am not entirely sure if this is a stat card issue, however I do believe that it is a genuine difference in performance between the aircraft as of right now. Moving on to the Russians, they've got the Strela 10M2. This is going to carry the 9M37 surface-to-air missile. No gun to be fitted if you were to not include the PKM on the front. So that's the big difference between this and things like the LAVAD and the Gepard 1A2 at similar BRs. However, it does have a very interesting missile. So whereas the Stinger will be able to launch air targets all aspect to pretty much its maximum range of 3.7ish miles, this can do 3.7 miles if you get a rear aspect. All aspect it's only going to be 1.86 miles, so front aspect this thing will be slightly less capable, however it should still be very, very solid. Pull wise, you're going to be looking at 20 Gs, which is of course better than the Stinger's rated 10 Gs, and it does carry more explosive mass, so the issue of the Stinger's not being able to one-hit aircraft probably won't affect this thing too much. However, its chassis is very, very weak, and you are very vulnerable to machine gun fire in this thing. However, given it's an AA, that's to be expected to some extent. In terms of aviation, the new Rank 7 Premium that the Russians get is the MiG-23 ML. This is going to work very much as a hybrid between the MLD and the M. In terms of how it looks, it doesn't seem to have the performance upgrades of the MLD, so you'll notice it doesn't have the teeth the MLD has right here, and it doesn't seem to have the speared out nose on the, I think there's a pitot tube on the front. That's very much because it's gonna fly more like the MiG-23M than the MLD. However, it does get the R-24R and T, which is a very strong missile, which the MLD gets. So what you essentially are paying for is an MLD that flies slightly worse at the same BR, or if you want to look at it another way, the MiG-23M with better missiles. I think this is probably the worst of the premiums that is on offer currently in rank 7, as it is a direct downgrade over the tech tree counterpart. However, if you are looking for something to grind the MiG-29, you really don't have a better choice right now, and I think Gaijin knows that. Of course, as everyone knows, the Russians have also now received the MiG-29 Fulcrum. This thing is in a very interesting spot currently, so since the test server, as many people know, it's lost its R-73 missile, it does still have its helmet-mounted capability with missiles, and it does still have R-27Rs and Ts, which are relatively good missiles. They perform quite similarly to the R-24. However, people I've heard flying the MiG-29 have complained about its capacity to just go for flares instead of the aircraft. Speaking of flares, this thing does seem to be in an awkward position with its flares currently, where their location is around here, I think, and it goes upwards, which is not too dissimilar to other MiGs. However, it doesn't seem to work very well. I'm not sure if this thing burns hot or if it's just the position of the flares are genuinely that ineffective, but I have engaged and killed multiple MiG-29s with angles and shots and missiles that reasonably shouldn't have been able to hit, given they were flaring, and just have regardless. It does have a very nice gun. That's probably the best thing about this thing currently, not including its flight performance, which is very, very, very much the best of any aircraft right now. This is going to fly fantastically if you get your hands on it, and it should be a very solid performer in dogfights and the like, where you're going down to guns. However, its missiles just let it down. R60Ms are going to be the bulk of what you're firing, which, as we know, whilst a capable missile, very, 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 very much want to go for flares, and that is going to be an issue when you're engaging aircraft that have as many flares as the American aircraft do. You're going to struggle with this thing currently. I think I've heard a few people say it would not be surprising if this thing actually gets its R-73s back just to try and push it into relevance. However, as things stand right now, I would not want to take this thing out against an F-16. Britain has received a new premium ground vehicle. This is the Khalid. It's going to perform similarly to the Chieftain Mark V, however it's at the battle rating of the Chieftain Mark X. Chieftain Mark X, of course, gains its battle rating off of virtue of receiving the Stillbrew armor, which gives it a very strong turret, makes this thing very, very difficult to engage from a hold down position, and it does also get its L-23 APFSDS shot with 410mm penetration, which is a very solid shell to have at that BR. The Khalid sharing the BR loses not only the Stillbrew armor, but it also doesn't get the L-23 shot using L-15A3, which is the same shell you get on the earlier Chieftains and is not APFSDS. It does still have the laser rangefinder, however the loss of shell and the Stillbrew armor is very substantial and something you're going to notice at 9.0 BR. The trade-off for this is it receives a much, much, much more powerful engine, putting out 1061 brake horsepower. The biggest complaint a lot of people have about the Chieftain tanks is that they just do not have the power to drag around the weight of the vehicle. So it is something that a lot of Chieftain mains would have wished for, a more powerful engine. However, given that it's a hike in BR and a loss of a shell and armor, it's going to be very difficult to see this thing being particularly tempting to a lot of people outside of those who just want to collect the chieftains, which honestly I can kind of respect. I do like the chieftain a lot. Britain's got several new aircraft. I'll start with the squadron vehicle they have, which is the Sea Harrier FRS-1. This thing should be very much along the lines of the Falkland spec, so it's going to carry AIM-9Ls. It does actually have a radar, which you're not going to see too much use for, however it is there regardless. Does carry the Mark 103 Pegasus engine that the AV8A and C and the GR3 all carry, so performance-wise this thing is going to be very similar to the Harrier 1s that we already have in game, not the Harrier 2s like the GR7, but it should accelerate very well. However, outside of that, it's going to struggle quite a bit with doing various maneuvers. You do also, of course, have the capacity to thrust vector to try and get turns on a little bit better, but 10.7, this thing is not going to have the flight performance. What it does have, though, is 4 AIM-9Ls, which is going to be incredibly strong at 10.7. This is going to give the Harrier the ability to basically guarantee kills in rear aspect against flareless enemies. Of course, you've got the front aspect capability. Also, the Aiden's not a great amount of ammo. I know a lot of people aren't too keen on these 30 mils. However, I think they're perfectly serviceable Overall, I think this thing should be relatively good, and at 10.7, having 4 aim 9Ls, flares, and good acceleration should be enough to make this thing strong. However, we'll have to wait and see. Britain's Rank 7 Premium is the F4J. This is going to be a sort of hybrid between the FGR and the F4J, similarities to both but differences as well. So it's going to have the helmet mounted capability with its 9Gs that the F4J has received this patch. However, it's not going to get the AIM-7F, it's going to get the Sky Flash like the FGR. It's going to get the Vulcan like the FGR and not the F4J. However, it's going to have the General Electric engines like the F4J, not the FGR. One of the things I really liked about using the Sky Flash with the FGR was the fact that the FGR is very, very, very fast. It's probably the fastest Phantom in game. It's got the fantastic Rolls-Royce engines, which are very powerful. And coupling that together, you've got a very interesting playstyle of aircraft. This thing is going to fly very similarly to the F4J, but losing the 7F for the Sky Flash I'm not sure is worth it, since what you have really is at 11.3 a slightly worse performing FGR. However, the helmet functionality might be enough to offset that. I'm not sure how strong that's going to be. We'll have to wait and see down the line. Britain does have the Tornado. As I mentioned earlier, this is on stat card at 200 miles per hour slower and a couple seconds slower in a turn. So if the stat card is to be believed, this is going to be much weaker than the Germans' Tornado. Again, you get Paveway 3s and Paveway 2s, which are going to be very serviceable in terms of a ground battle. You've got the 27mm Mauser, and you've got 2 AIM-9Ls. In terms of flight performance, even with the German Tornado, I don't think the Tornado is going to be incredibly efficient right now. It's going to suffer a lot at rank 8, which is where it's at. At 11.3, when you're running into Tomcats and the likes, it's going to get its ass handed to it. Even the GR1 that the British have is going to suffer even more if the stat card's to be believed. So I think if you get your hands on a Tornado, feel free to take it out in a ground battle, but I would steer very much clear of air battles because the Tornado is just not going to have the facilities to hold its own. Similarly to the rest of the nations, Japan has a new 8.8 Sub-12. It's going to have the 20mm Rheinmetall gun that people should be familiar with at this point. It doesn't have any capability of tracking with the 20mm, however it's 5.3, so that's not to be expected. Very weak hull, similar to the Type 75. You're going to get 50 cal if they catch you side on, and possibly even from the front if they get you at the right angle at close range. But the 20mm is very good. It takes a dual belt system, so you can reload it faster if you're using 2 separate belts. And it does get DM63 APDS, which 66mm penetration at 5.3. This thing could turn out to be quite strong if you're able to catch people off guard or on a flank. Something worth mentioning is that the operator for this 20mm does actually stick out of the tank, so even when you're not engaged by a 50 cal, even when it's a 30 cal, people are going to be able to knock out your gunner. You will be slightly protected just by the sheer volume of shit that sits in front of him, however, it's not a guarantee and it's fairly likely that a straight 30 cal will take him out. Japan have also received their Rank 7 Premium. It's an air development test wing version of the F4EJ. Performance-wise, this thing's going to be pretty much identical to the Tech Tree F4EJ. You've got the onboard 20mm that's going to reduce drag compared to other Phantom variants. It's capable of carrying the AIM-9P, which is just going to be an export version of the 9J, and the AIM-7E, which is the same as what the A4EJ gets on the Tech Tree. However, obviously the American F4E gets the AIM-7E2, which is a direct upgrade over the AIM-7E. So in terms of 11.0s, it's not going to be outstanding performance-wise. However, it should still be capable of holding its own a little bit. Of all the Rank 7 premiums that have been added this patch, this is probably the one I think is the least tempting in my opinion. This is the one I would want perhaps less than the rest of them. However, if again, as with the MiG-23ML, if you're looking to grind the Japanese jets, you don't really have a better option right now. So if you are desperate, it's there for you. Also, the EJ Kai Phantom, still at 11.3, however, it does now have AIM-9Ls, which should make this thing significantly stronger. It's actually a little confusing to me that this thing's 11.3 like the F4J and the FGR with it getting AIM-9Ls. I think maybe the F4J and the FGR need to go down in BR, or maybe if this thing performs really well with its 9Ls, this could go up in BR, but as of right now, this is the strongest Phantom in-game by some margin, and you probably don't want to find yourself in front of this thing because 9Ls just are very difficult to flare. China have a new top tier MBT. They have the WZ-1001 ELCT. I don't play a lot of China and I'm not too familiar with top tier ground forces. However, looking at this thing through the protection analysis, obviously this huge ERA that's been bricked onto the front is going to be very difficult to defeat with Heat FS shells. However, even if you move to look at the APFS DS shell this thing carries, it is barely protected. There's obviously a few spots here and there if you get around the ERA, you're going to be able to go through it. However, if you are hitting the ERA, it's going to stop even APFSDS. So it should be a relatively good tank. I think if you get this thing hull down, it's going to be similar to an Abrams in that there are definite shots to be made that can kill. However, you're not going to be too disposed to finding those shots, especially at longer range. So this thing should actually be relatively interesting. In terms of the shells this thing gets, DTC 10125, very capable APFSDS shell, 588mm penetration, should be more than capable of dealing with a lot of the threats you encounter. First, I think you get a 1251, which is a rank 1 unlock, thankfully, so you don't have to deal with the EDFS for too long. Or you will also get access to a variable timed shell, which might be useful against helicopters, and a tandem ATGM, which is always interesting to play around with. China's rank 7 premium is going to be the J7D. This thing's going to fly very similarly to the MiG-21 BIS, more so than the J7E, because it doesn't have the double staged wing that the J7E does, which means you're not going to have the turn fighting and the rate fighting capability of the J7E, unfortunately. However, at rank 7, it does have access to the PL7 missile, which is going to perform very similarly to the Magic ones that the French get. It should be a very good missile overall. However, with it being similar to the Magic 1s and not the Magic 2s, it is rear aspect only, which makes this the only battle rating 11 MiG-21 style aircraft that doesn't have an all aspect missile. However, I do think the Magics are still very solid and this should be a good aircraft to use all around. It might suffer against F-16s and MiG-21s, however, that's just going to be the nature of all MiG-21s as of right now. They are not in the best position even at 11.0. If you do get a down tier though, this thing should be very, very strong. Against 10.0s like F4Cs, this thing is just going to tear them apart. There is nothing they can do against a Magic 1. We've seen that with the A5C. China have received the Taiwanese F-16A MLU, that stands for Midlife Upgrade, so it has the improved control surface at the rear. It does also get access to the AIM-7M that the American one does, and some of the ground ordnance that the F-16A gets, not the ADF. So this is going to be the best all-round aircraft in the game, without a doubt. It's going to be able to carry Sparrows, 9Ls, and do plenty of ground pounding if need be. Generally speaking, this is just a mishmash of the other F-16s. Not much more to say on it. It's going to be as competent as the ADF and the A in terms of ground striking. It's going to be personal preference what you want to carry and what you want to use it for. Italy, yet again, new SPAA. So they have received the CM52. This thing is just another quad 50 cal truck. As we've seen on other vehicles like the M16, quad 50 cals are absolutely monstrous at low BR. High velocity, easy to aim, you got a lot of ammunition, they do a lot of damage. This thing's going to do very well. I think it's a very nice addition to the Italian SPA tree. I know some people are sick of seeing the quad 50 cal AAs, but it's a very good AA. I don't see why it shouldn't be given to the Italians if they have a valid vehicle and platform for it. The Italians have also received a new F-104S. This is pretty much just the same as the Tech Tree one, except slightly higher rank. The Tech Tree one has now finally received countermeasures, which I know a lot of people are looking forward to or hoping. It is Turkish. If you are Turkish, it might be something that draws you towards the aircraft. However, beyond that, it's just another F-104. At 10.7, this thing is a little bit less competent than a lot of the other 10.7s that you might end up encountering. It does get access to the Sparrows, however these early Sparrows, they're not particularly strong and you do lose the gun for carrying them, so I don't think there's any real reason to look for them. Gets access to 6 AIM-9Ps, which are of course just 9J exports. Probably a slightly underappreciated missile. I think it's still pretty good. However, the issue is it's not got the range of a 9G or a 9H, and it doesn't have the all aspect functionality of the 9L, so they're not fantastic, but should be good enough to get you a kill here and there. Also, you do, if you fit it, have access to the Vulcan with plenty of ammunition in this thing, which should make it relatively good for gun kills. As I said, the Vulcan's doing a little bit less damage than you would hope right now, but it should still be solid. F-16A ADF, we've seen this with the Americans already, gets access to the AIM-7M, gets access to AIM-9Ls, should be very solid. Having flown the American one, I will say that the US F-16 ADF feels like one of the strongest aircraft in the game currently. Can't see any reason the Italians wouldn't have the same situation. Italy has another Tornado, it's another interdictor variant. 200 miles per hour slower than the German one, a couple seconds slower in a turn than the German one. Cannot explain why currently, cannot say for sure if that's the case in game. Pay voids 2 and 3 should be very, very strong for ground striking. 2 AIM-9Ls can defend itself, however I would not suggest taking this thing into an air battle just yet. The French have received something I know a lot of people have been hoping for a while, such as Alex, who likes playing these fat fuck tanks. The Char 2C Bis, this thing was obviously on Battlefield 1, I think that's where a lot of people know it from. Right now, I think it's going to perform a little bit similarly to the T-35, and that you're going to have perhaps a little bit of a hard time killing this thing, purely just because of the number of crew that are in this. However, its armor is not fantastic. People who are hoping that this would be perhaps similar to the B1 and the B1 Tech Tree variant are going to be a little bit surprised, because the armor of this thing is not terrible. It's definitely going to hold up against some shells. However, even at 1.7, a lot of things are just going to be cutting through this, and that's going to cause you issues if you're getting caught with the loader dying mid-reload, because this thing does take 22 seconds to reload. I know on the test server it was reloading faster than that. I can confirm from testing it in a test drive now that that is no longer the case. It reloads, as it says, 22 seconds, which can be a while. However, it is reloading a 155mm gun with a large amount of explosives in it and 58mm penetration. Can't imagine there's going to be too much you will see at 2.7 that this thing is not one-shotting. However, just be mindful of that reload and you should be fine. Worth pointing out, with the huge radiator stack you've got on the massive engine that's in the middle of this thing, you are not able to turn the turret all the way around. In testing, I found you could turn it a little bit beyond 120 degrees, but not too much. So if you are caught with someone behind you on your tracks out, you might have a difficult time defending yourself. I've also received the AMX-32-105. This is just a slightly earlier version of the AMX MBT that we see. It does feature the 20mm coax that was removed from later versions, and the 105 that is, honestly, probably fairly competent. 361mm penetration at 9.0, very much more than you would need, and the 105 itself seems like it's going to perform decently in terms of damage output. I think this is a nice addition to the French line. I think it's something that a lot of people should go for. I think it's going to be one of the more enjoyable French MBTs, honestly. In terms of aviation, rank 7 premium that the French are getting is the Mirage F1C 200. Its closest comparison is going to be the Mirage F1C in the Tech Tree rather than the F1CT. So like the Tech Tree, F1C does have the two DEFAs, which are very hit and miss. 30 mils, a little bit wonky, depends on your playstyle, how much you're going to enjoy using them. It does get access though to the Magic 2 missile, which is a very, very good missile right now. 35G pull, all aspect capability, very good burn time, very good acceleration. It does also have access to the radar missiles. These are serviceable, as I would word them. They're not going to hold up too well against an AIM-7F. However, if you're looking for something for a front aspect kill, I would generally not use infrared missiles in front aspect because they're very easy to flare when used front aspect, so I probably would avoid using the Magic 2s in that situation. If you do have one of the radar missiles on, the radar on this isn't fantastic, but it is enough for you to fire on someone at close range, get the kill and pull away. The Mirage F1 at 11.3 right now is not performing too great. It suffers quite badly from compression and is, generally speaking, not the best aircraft you want to end up in a dogfight with. However, the missiles that this thing gets are very strong, and it should be an easy enough plane to use off of the back of its missiles if you accept that the second you run into another 11.3 like an MLD or a Tomcat, you're just dead. There is not a lot you will be doing in this thing to defend yourself, and it is not the best premium that they could have chosen. However, looking at them, I can understand why we've ended up with the F1C. France has also received a new Mirage 2000. They've received the D variant. This is a two-seater with a Wizzo in the back. Obviously, this is a ground strike oriented version of the Mirage 2000. Its performance does suffer slightly as a cost of this, but it does get access to things such as the AS-30L Nord anti-tank missile, It's also got access to paveways, different paveways, and the BGL 1000, which is a very interesting looking bomb. Of course, on top of that, you are going to have access to a bunch of unguided ordnance if you prefer to use so, and you will still be able to carry magic 2s for defending yourself. Overall, it's going to be an interesting aircraft capable of defending itself. A little bit light on the ground strike capability, but ultimately you pay for that by being still very quick and very maneuverable. Finland's also received a T-55. It's going to be pretty similar to the T-55A in the Russian tree, however this is the M variant and sits at a slightly higher BR. For this slight increase in BR, you get a new shell, M1000A1, slightly better performing APFSDS than the Russian variant, however it's almost negligible if I'm being honest with you. I think the main reason for this increase in BR is going to be the laser rangefinder that this tank gets. It's going to be very helpful for long range engagements. I will just say I'm very happy to see a new T-55 in the game. I think for the number of these that exist in real life, we don't have enough in game, and I would really like to see a German T-55 at some point in the future. Sweden has received their rank 7 premium, being the J35XS Draken. This is a Finnish version of the Draken, and it has something a lot of people, including myself, have wanted for a very long time: countermeasures. I have been told that the number of countermeasures the Draken will receive is actually still very, very small. However, I will say countermeasures are obviously better than no countermeasures. However, if you're going into this hoping you can flare dump like a Harrier, probably worth keeping your expectations slightly lower. It does have IRST and a solid radar, as most of the Drakens do. However, Drakens don't carry radar missiles, so this is kind of more of a searching point, and if you were going to play this in Sim, would probably be helpful in that scenario. It does lose one of the 30mm Akens, and as such has less ammo. You're down to 90 rounds, so this thing is not going to be too functional as a gunfighter. However, you do still get access to 6 RB-24Js. These perform very similarly to the AIM-9J, which, as I mentioned earlier, is still a serviceable missile despite a lot of the flak it gets. I think it's going to be an interesting plane at 10.7, and honestly is probably an upgrade over the J35D in the tech tree. Sweden have also received their rank 8 with the JA37D Viggen. Performance-wise, this looks pretty much identical to the JA37C Viggen that precedes it, but has gone up by 0.7 of a BR. I can say that it does receive the RB-74 missile, which is going to be pretty much identical to the AIM-9L, which again is a very, very solid missile. I think the trade-off for 0.7 BR to receive a much more potent missile is probably worth it, since the preceding Viggen was using AIM-9Js, which especially at 11.7 are going to start to show their age a little bit. Israel received the Magak 7C, following on from the rest of the Magaks. This is another pattern with substantial armor upgrades. However, it's worth pointing out if you end up against Heat FS, whilst this thing will be able to protect itself relatively well around the turret and upper plate and even lower plate, you're probably not going to get pinned by Heat FS. When you do run into APFSDS, and at 9.3 that is going to happen, you're not incredibly well protected. However, in a sort of weird way, the added-on armor does provide the benefit of obscuring where your turret truly is, which is something I've noticed with a lot of tanks like this. Obviously underneath this is just a regular pattern turret. However, with all the added-on armor, especially from the front, it can be very difficult to know where you're hitting the turret and where you're just piercing